Well, good afternoon. We set up this lecture in honor of our distinguished founder, Barbara Ward, thinker and broadcaster, author of many books, and public intellectual. Best known probably in this audience for her landmark book, Only One Earth, published 40 years ago. Best known also for her advocacy of what we now think of as sustainable development, a development path that meets the needs of all today without compromising those of future generations. Never were her thinking and ideas more necessary than today as we grapple with multiple difficulties associated with addressing poverty and climate change. We're very fortunate to have today as our speaker Christiana Figueres, the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, agreed 20 years ago in Rio at the Earth Summit, the 20th anniversary of which we will celebrate and recognize in June this year. Christiana is a clear-headed, skilled diplomat, articulate and unwavering in the energy she applies to the job of corralling the parties to the Climate Change Convention. I see from her biography that she's got degrees in anthropology, one of which is from LSE, a study and a set of methods which are probably very helpful in the negotiation process. Though maybe also a degree in animal behavior could also be quite valuable. She'll be familiar to many of you, having taken up her role at the UNFCCC nearly 2 years ago. Prior to that, having had a career in the negotiations process for Costa Rica and Latin America. After the disappointments of COP15 at Copenhagen, our spirits lifted at Durban last December with the firming up of an alliance between the LDCs, AOSIS, and the EU. But as we'll hear, there's still a long way to go. While climate change has rather dropped out of the news, that doesn't mean, sadly, that it's gone away. It remains a huge challenge, existential in its threat to human life, particularly in poorer and more vulnerable countries. IIED will be hosting the 6th annual workshop on community-based adaptation in Vietnam next month to help spread learning about bottom-up ways to build resilience. Christiana will speak for 25-30 minutes, followed by a session of questions and answers from the floor. There's then a special session for media and journalists at the end, so we'll give priority to questions from the non-media world. And as we're live streaming this event, thanks to One Climate, please can you make sure that you've turned off your mobile phones? For those of you tweeting this afternoon, the hashtag is IIEDBWard, and the wireless access code, I think, is on the screen. I'm required to tell you that in the event of a fire, on hearing the alarm, we have to leave this hall immediately by the central doors or the door at the back of the hall. You leave the building immediately, turn left along the pavement without crossing the road, pass beyond the end of the building and wait at the bottom of cockpit steps. Thank you. Christiana.
Well, thank you very much, Camilla. When you were warning us about a fire, I thought, well, you know, that's exactly what we need. We need a fire under everybody's belly is exactly what we need. So I hope that we can light a fire here. So Camilla, thank you very much for the kind invitation. It does give me great pleasure to deliver this year's Barbara Ward lecture here at the IIED. But honestly, Camilla, I don't know if you do me or anybody else a favor by putting out an invitation to participate in a lecture series named after what Time magazine called one of the most influential visionaries of the 20th century. Frankly, that sort of makes your feet shaky up here behind the lectern. But that is quite different from what that visionary woman once said. And let me quote, "We live in an epoch in which the solid ground of our preconceived ideas shakes daily under our certain feet." So already in the 1970s, Barbour knew that business as usual no longer represented solid ground. Always ahead of her time, she knew that we have to combine our immediate commitment to meeting human needs with our longer-term need to protect the earth as a place suitable for human life now and in the future. She consistently stressed the need to simultaneously address what she called the inner limits of human requirements and the outer limits of what the earth can sustain. With this, she in fact laid, as Camilla has already mentioned, the basis for the later Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development. Well, Barbour gave us a very firm foundation 50 years ago. So the question for us today is, what have we built on this foundation since then? We're all very aware of the increasing understanding that we all share of the concept of sustainable development, what we have achieved since 1972, not least of all the 1992 Rio Summit, the birth of the Rio Conventions, of which the Framework Convention for Climate Change is one, and of course, all the work achieved under each of those conventions. But now we are fast approaching the opening of the Rio +20 conference, which will allow the world to both take stock of past efforts as well as look to the future. And with business as usual, making the ground under our feet shake now more than ever before, with billions of people still in abject poverty, and with environmental depletion and greenhouse gas emissions at an all-time high, one cannot help but conclude that this is not what Barbara Ward had in mind. We, the human race, the only stewards of this planet, need to double up our efforts. While arriving at the concept of sustainable development was a critical breakthrough in the 1970s and 80s, and while putting in place the policy frameworks that would drive sustainable development was a laudable achievement in the 1990s and early 2000s, I think we would all agree that we have put much more time and energy into reading, writing, and thinking about sustainable development than we have into acting on sustainable development. And acting to get the world onto a truly sustainable pathway has now become an urgent imperative. Still, over 3 billion people live on less than $2.5 a day. Still, over 1 billion people have no access to clean water. Still, 1.6 billion people have no access to electricity. Still, 1.2 billion people suffer from chronic hunger. And this is the 21st century, a time in which not only is that situation completely morally unacceptable, but a moment in which we have realized that climate change and its impacts will exacerbate the suffering of the billions of people that make up those painful statistics. In fact, climate change has the potential to undo many of the development gains that have been made, including in the context of the Millennium Development Goals. Yet, still, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable development now needs a decisive breakthrough. But this time, it's not a breakthrough of concepts of understanding. This time, it is a decided breakthrough on action. The time for concept development is long past. The urgency for action is upon us. We must trigger the sustainability transformation now, and a critical component of that is the energy revolution that needs to both address emissions and power the world's move into a sustainable future. And there I pause because several people have asked me, what do you mean by a revolution? Well, being the daughter of a revolutionary who did have to take up arms, I have to say, even if it would disappoint my father, that's not the kind of revolution that I'm talking about. The kind of revolution that I'm talking about is the kind of revolution that we have seen over the past 20 to 30 years in the information and communication technology, where we have moved from the first cell phone that weighed 3 pounds and could barely carry voice to the little credit card type devices that now do everything except cook our dinner at night. So that's the kind of revolution that we need in the energy sector, and we need it urgently. And the good news, however, is that we are not starting from scratch. Momentum for both the sustainability and the energy revolutions is building. And this can be seen in both emerging policies and in growing investment trends. Key emerging policies include both climate change and renewable aspects. Almost all countries have climate change policies in place that deal with both adaptation to the impacts of climate change as well as with emission reductions or mitigation. Are they enough? Probably not, but they are there to be built upon. All industrialized countries have specific mitigation pledges to 2020. 49 developing countries have mitigation pledges to 2020. And 118 countries now have renewable energy policies in place. In terms of investment trends, the transformation is slowly becoming visible. And I would like to underline, is powering ahead despite the difficult economic and investment conditions. And it was one of my huge discoveries at the recent Davos conference that the commitment to continue that kind of investment is still there with companies despite the financial situations that they're living in. In fact, last December, Bloomberg reported that the trillionth dollar of investment in renewable energy had just been made. Clean and renewable energy solutions are becoming the smart investment of the future because they will thrive in almost any economic scenario. Now, next to increasing investments and budding national policies, international climate policy is becoming clearer and is now an important contributing factor, I would argue, to sustainable development and the clean energy revolution. In that context, allow me to give you a quick overview of the Durban Climate Change Conference and its outcomes. I believe that time will show that the Durban Climate Change Conference was the most encompassing and the furthest reaching conference in the history of the climate change negotiations. But just to find out where all of you were, let me ask, because the media coverage of Durban was quite mixed. So raise your hands if you have concluded that Durban was a failure and that it made minimal progress at best. Who would agree with that? Be courageous. You can definitely put your hands up. Seriously, only a few of you. Okay, so raise your hands if you think Durban was actually a good opportunity to make some decisive progress, but still left a lot undone. Oh, this is a very friendly crowd. Okay, so I guess I would be somewhere in the middle of both of those opinions. I'm the first one to acknowledge frustration with the pace of the international negotiations, but allow me to give you anyway a quick overview from my perspective, from the perspective of someone who's been in this process for 15 years, and who is still alive to tell the story. In terms of emission reductions, Durban achieved a groundbreaking agreement on a path to universal participation in mitigation efforts. This path is to be taken in 3 steps of increasing ambition. First, the continuation of the Kyoto Protocol, thereby ensuring the continuity of the legal system and of the Kyoto rules, the most important part of the continuation of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this year, governments are going to have to agree on the length of the second commitment period, whether it's going to be 5 or 8 years, and they will have to inscribe their quantified emission reductions for that second commitment period. But the protocol only covers 15 to 10 to 15 at best % of global emissions. And it's very clear to governments that efforts must go way beyond that. So in Durban, governments also confirmed their intent to undertake broader and immediate mitigation action outside of the protocol. So the second step is, under the convention, Durban cemented mitigation plans of all industrialized nations, including those not under the Kyoto Protocol, plus the mitigation plans of 49 developing nations. The sum of those countries accounts for 80% of global emissions, so good news, a higher level of participation than under the Kyoto Protocol, but that participation will be voluntary, although rigorously measured, from now until 2020. So as a third step, governments recognized that there must be more certainty than that which is offered by voluntary action, and therefore in Durban they decided to embark on a future legal framework that will cover all nations of the world, to be negotiated by 2015 and go into effect by 2020. This universal participation in legally grounded mitigation targets is a remarkable departure from the past and Durban's major gift. A strategy as ambitious as the above must be effectively supported and responsibly guided. Governments, therefore, in Durban further established the infrastructure to support developing countries by successfully launching the Adaptation Committee, the Green Climate Fund, and the Technology Mechanism. Last, but perhaps most importantly, in Durban there was a clear realization that the level of mitigation ambition needs to be raised beyond that which is currently on the table. Current emission reduction pledges account for only 60%, if they are all fulfilled, of what is needed to stabilize temperature rise to below 2 degrees, let alone to the 1.5 degrees, which is the only temperature maximum that guarantees the survival of the most vulnerable. In realization of that shortcoming, countries agreed to an immediate work program on increasing mitigation levels now up to and beyond 2015. So with these results, there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that Durban delivered beyond expectations. While much of its outcomes are complex and technical, 2 things stand out for me. 1, the universal political will to act on climate change is tangible. And 2, even more so than in the also successful previous conference in Cancun, Durban was a loud message for the world. The future is unmistakably low carbon. So governments have clearly set the direction. But this is not enough. The outcomes from Durban will make a significant contribution towards a more sustainable future if, and only if, all pledges, aspirations, and plans are fully implemented. Considering the scale of the transformation necessary for the sustainability revolution, it is clear that governments cannot deliver on their own. One of the themes that ran through Barbara Ward's life was that of cooperation, and let me quote, "Cooperation across seas, across frontiers, and across cultures. Cooperation for human renewal and development." Meeting the challenge we face will be impossible without an unprecedented level of cooperation among public, private, and civil society sectors. This is as true for implementing the Durban outcomes as it is for achieving the sustainability revolution more generally. Between now and 2015, the climate policy making process needs decided encouragement, an encouragement that should come through concrete action. Action that moves us closer to the energy revolution that we need. Beyond governments, this concerns business and civil society. I fully understand the many private sector calls for absolute policy clarity before business can invest with total confidence. But let us remember that even in the absence of policy perfection, the trillionth dollar has been invested in renewable energy. That market trend is encouraging and begins to pre-adapt economies to the new low-carbon era. I'm encouraged that some enlightened companies have taken the lead, but that is not enough. The outcomes from Durban will make a significant contribution towards a more sustainable future if progressive companies take the lead now and committed civil society remains engaged. Civil society organizations can be a powerful, vocal support that influences consumer behavior and gives policymakers a broader political space in which to act courageously. And so today I stand before you with a clear request. Whether you represent government, business, or civil society, take the unambiguous Durban signals and help us increase action through new partnerships. Help us to ignite action to such a level that it can power and maintain momentum for the sustainability revolution, that it can help alleviate poverty, that it can help boost policymakers' confidence. Help us make the revolution real. Help us achieve the change that we so urgently need. In her book, Only One Earth, Barbara Ward wrote, "We have forgotten how to be good guests, how to walk lightly on the earth, as its other creatures do." It is my sincere hope that with an accelerated drive for sustainability and climate change action, we can finally learn to be good guests and to tread lightly on the earth. And pardon me if today I, as your guest, have not followed the rules of treading lightly and have come here with a very heavy message. But it is my sincere hope that through actions now, on the part of every single one of us, we can begin to live up to the visionary ideas that Barbara Ward planted 50 years ago. Her memory demands our unequivocal action. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christiana, for that wonderful message of energy, of push, of aspiration.
Fire in the belly.
And fire in the belly. A good revolutionary background you have indeed. And we've now got 30 minutes or so for questions. We've got 2 mics, which you do need to use for us to be able to get them properly recorded onto our system. So can I take perhaps groups of 3 questions? Can you please say who you are and give us a shortish question rather than long statements. Andy, at the back there.
Christiana, thank you very much for that. That was really, really helpful. And I was interested when you spoke of leadership, you were talking about businesses taking lead. Of course they must. But we have quite a debate going here in the UK, and I'd just like your view on it. Surely there is a need for countries also to lead, but much of the emphasis has inevitably been on the big emitters like the US, like China, and so on. Is there a role for smaller countries like the UK to still show leadership on climate, or doesn't it matter anymore? We just need America and China to move.
Should we take three? Yeah.
Tara Garnett from the Food Climate Research Network. It's a linked question. One is, what do you see the role of action on agricultural mitigation with adaptation in helping achieve the emission cuts we need? And linked to that, what is the role of rich world changes, not in technological innovation, but in consumption habits in achieving mitigation?
And Tim Williams from Panos London. The Durban COP was the first one that I attended, and my very strong impression for that was that the people who understand climate change the most are those who depend on the land in the global south. So I'd be interested to know how you think their voices can reach the negotiators more effectively.
My name is Carlos dos Santos. I'm the High Commissioner for Mozambique. Thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was very informative and excellent. My first question was, after Durban, we have Rio. What would be the expectations from Rio after Durban? If we are to achieve the target set in Durban. And the second question has to do with the least developed countries. What is expected of them, knowing the constraints that they face of everyday development needs and priorities?
Good, thanks very much. I must say, coming from a country the size of Costa Rica, to hear somebody say, the smaller countries like the UK, that's quite heartening. Is there a role for the smaller countries to lead? Absolutely. Absolutely, and I would say on two levels. First, if you put the UK into the small category, I would have to put Costa Rica into the tiny, tiny, tiny category. But even for the tiny, tiny categories, let me start there. There's a huge opportunity to lead. And I'm heartened that many of those tiny countries are really leading because they are showing the way. There is, frankly, we are beyond the point in which anybody can say, I'm so small that I don't have any responsibility. Furthermore, we're beyond the point in which anybody can say, I'm so small that I can't find any opportunity in this for myself. And that is I think, where we can really get traction. And I would actually like to bring that up with the question on the LDCs. Absolutely clear that the LDCs have many other urgent needs, so that it would be very easy to say the first need is water, energy, food, and I'll worry about climate change later. The problem is that we cannot separate those two things anymore. The problem is that, as I mentioned, climate is going to exacerbate the problems of water, food, and energy. And so unless we look at development in the developing countries with a climate change lens, we are walking down a plank that is going to be very, very dangerous. So it is not about the responsibility of small countries or LDCs or the Costa Ricas of this world. It's not about their responsibility to take the leadership in mitigation. It is about realizing the vulnerabilities that we all have and actually turning around so that we would be able to develop in a much more sustainable way for our populations. And in the UK, I would want to combine that with the question on consumption habits, because it's not just the UK, it is the entire OECD that clearly has a very, very clear responsibility here on consumption habits and on sheer waste. Probably less on this side of the pond, but on the other side of the pond, there is just enormous waste of energy. And we've reached the point where that is completely irresponsible and no longer sustainable. So very, very important for each of the different groups of countries to see it from their own perspective. I wouldn't say that consumption patterns is what the LDCs have to look at, but certainly the production patterns that they will aspire to. On agriculture, a topic that is, one would think not only very akin, but actually front and central for climate change. And yet, it took years and years of negotiation for parties to finally agree that they would address agriculture within the climate context. And that happened in Durban. That's miracle number 73.5 in Durban. And the conversation around including agriculture was made difficult by many different aspects, but among them, because parties couldn't agree, there were some countries that wanted to say, let's look at agriculture, but only as a tool for mitigation, and there were many countries that were saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Agriculture also needs to be viewed from the adaptation perspective, and it was difficult for them to actually bring these two together. So now what we have is finally a door to begin this conversation, but it is very, very much in its incipient stages. And it's actually a very exciting week for us in the agriculture space in Climate Secretariat, because this is the week in which we are receiving all of the views from NGOs and from countries as to how they would like to take the agriculture topic forward. So I've been beating the drums in many countries to get more views, but we will be looking at that now for the first time. And that is actually a sad statement, because, as you say, yes, absolutely, those who depend on agriculture are also some of the most vulnerable because of the water-food nexus with climate change. And it is only now that we are beginning that conversation. But the door is open, so inputs are very, very welcome. On Rio Plus 20, there will be no climate negotiations at Rio because that's not the venue to negotiate. So the negotiations go from Durban to Doha at the end of the year. But Rio is the 20th birthday party of the convention, so we will be there to light our candles. But also, of course, Rio can be a very powerful force of wind in the sail of the whole concept of how do we continue to grow in the developing countries who need to continue to grow, but without the carbon footprint that has been attached to that growth in the north, because it is just completely impossible to do so. So what are the opportunities that, in particular, developing countries have to leapfrog and to do what we've done in the information industry? Look at the role of cell phones in developing countries. I am amazed, and I take actually pretty frequent pictures of, way in the boonies where you think, okay, nobody has ever tread here before, and you see somebody standing, on their cell phone. Well, how has that changed the quality of life of that person, of that community? And that's the kind of thing that we should be seeing. We should be seeing our addressing climate change as an opportunity to leapfrog over what is now obsolete energy technologies into new technologies that can really be at the basis of growth in the global south.
Simon at the back.
Simon Maxwell from CDK, and my train was delayed. I apologize for missing the beginning, and you may have answered these questions already, Christiana. I'm really curious to know how you felt on the Friday afternoon and Saturday morning in Durban when it looked as though it was going to be so difficult. What happened, and how you assess the shift that suddenly took place and the role of the EU, perhaps particularly in delivering a deal? And then what have you learned from Durban about the art form of managing international negotiations and delivering a global deal?
Thank you very much. I'm the High Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, and I want to first of all thank you very much for your very wonderful presentation. I'm particularly homing in on how do we move away from a developmental path that would want us to believe or follow the emerging countries with their fossil fuel to get the growth, and to be able to get the necessary technology transfer at reasonable and assisted developmental prices, because that's going to be the impetus to move us in that direction. If it's going to be too expensive, we will not be able to move that path, and we will not be able to get the benefit that everyone is looking to us for, because we're already seeing the impact in our environments.
Thank you. Yes.
Christoph Walter from Unilever. Thanks very much for the inspiring lecture. I was among the few people who raised their hand when you asked who thought Durban was not a success or under-delivered. And the reason I raised my hand was that I thought, yes, there was progress, but is that fast enough? And isn't the elephant in the room that the rate of progress that we are making is nowhere adequate if we look at the timescales and the urgency?
Okay, and one more here.
Thank you. Thank you. Abigail Burridge from the Local Government Association. And local government, although they can be required by central government under sort of statutory obligations, they also operate largely independently and can have a powerful influence on action. Do you think that more needs to be done to involve local government, or do you think local government's doing enough, perhaps more than national governments, or do you think it's just too complex to get down to that scale of detail?
How did I feel on Friday night? Completely exhausted, as everybody else did. Farhana, weren't you exhausted? Everybody. It was Sunday. Oh, okay. Everybody was completely exhausted. So what? Honestly, so what if you're tired? If the job hasn't been done, being tired is completely irrelevant. Okay? And that's the motto with which we operate, and I have to say I was so impressed that governments did the same. I can't tell you the barrage, of the press always, on top. Well, what are they doing? And why haven't they reached an agreement? Da, 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 da. And I understand that impatience. But my message to the press during those entire torturous last 36 hours was the governments are working, the governments are talking to each other, give them space, give them time. Because what was very, very clear to me when we arrived in Durban is that governments really wanted to take a next step. I don't think any of them knew exactly what that step was going to be, because you never know that, because the next step evolves as a collective effort. But all of them really wanted to take the next step. And it was clear by Friday night that that step hadn't occurred yet. And it was clear that everybody was on the phone, changing their plans for flights, et cetera, letting their spouses know I won't be home, da, da, da. Well, that's all very good news. That's all very good news. So what have I learned? I've learned, A, to read the tea leaves. And the tea leaves in Durban was they want to come to an agreement, and then to give them the space and time to do it, and not to put them under the pressure of the predetermined timing, because that's not necessarily the way things work in life. So to have opened the space, to have continued to open the dialogue, to give them all of the infrastructure that they needed, to give them the moral support, to continue to bring parties together that still needed to talk to each other and iron out differences, and just keep going, keep going. Patience and perseverance. Patience and perseverance. And I was born, when I was born, patience was long, as a virtue, was long given out to everybody else, okay? God said, oh, this poor child, she isn't getting any patience. But this job has taught me that patience is absolutely critical, which is in stark contrast to the urgency of the problem. Okay? That is our challenge. Because I will tell you for sure, we had 2 fantastic conferences in a row, Cancun and Durban. And we are gearing up for another very good meeting in Doha. But I will tell you for sure, this process will continue to go slowly because of the complexity of it, because of the diversity of interests and needs, and because there is not enough well up from the bottom up. I don't see millions of citizens standing somewhere demanding climate action. I just don't see it. I saw a couple of thousand in Durban, and I went and I talked to them, and they're impatient. And I'm grateful for that impatience. I wish there were more. But this is the reality we have to deal with, okay? That the process is very, very slow, and that the urgency is every day more. So the only way out of this is to continue to push on the government side, but also the fundamental message of my lecture today, do not depend 100% on governments because they can't deliver the 100%. If we are so irresponsible that we just export the responsibility to governments, then honestly we stand on very, very weak moral ground. Everybody has to accept their own responsibility of contributing as much as we can within our sphere of influence. And let me add to that local governments, actually, because local governments are actually where the rubber hits the road. Okay? So national governments come to these multilateral agreements slowly, but it is actually, with respect to policy and with respect to implementation, it's actually subnational governments, very frequently, that are the ones that are actually going to implement this. And so the role of subnational governments is absolutely critical, and I am delighted to see that as of the meeting in Cancun, where we had the Mexico Pact of, probably will get the number wrong, but I think 130, 140 mayors of around the world who came to sign the Mexico Pact of Action and putting forward their mitigation and adaptation targets. And in Durban then, another big wave of subnationals. So there is an ongoing and growing movement of subnational governments who have realized they can certainly contribute to this. The fact is that we have the majority of the population in our world lives in urban areas. And so just the role of cities, to take one specific example of local governments, just the role of cities and what cities can do is absolutely crucial. And I am delighted that subnational governments are now actively contributing here to this solution. And finally, on technology transfer at reasonable prices. Absolutely where we should be going. It is clear that countries like Antigua and Barbuda have an enormous resource of solar and perhaps even wind energy, but you can't use it at the prices in which those technologies are on the market now. And that is one of the purposes of the technology mechanism that I just sort of skimmed over today for time, but one of the purposes of the technology mechanism that has been launched is precisely that, is precisely to identify those technologies that are most promising, that are perhaps somewhat over the level in cost compared to the fossil fuel, and figure out how are those technologies going to be made, A, available, and B, commercial at reasonable prices so that they can actually be implemented. Not that anybody has found the solution, but at least the good news is there is now a network of really very good thinkers around the world putting all of their efforts together to figure this out. Not going to be figured out immediately, but certainly now there is a very clear line of action that is dealing with that topic.
Paddy, right in the middle there, Catherine, can you pass? And the lady next to him.
Paddy Coulter from Oxford Global Media. You said rather intriguingly, or you called the media coverage of Durban mixed, in your view. You were very understanding later when you talked about, you could understand press impatience at the protracted and seemingly inconclusive nature of the negotiations. Could I encourage you to be a bit more candid about what you really thought about the media coverage of Durban, and whether you think that the media can do a hell of a lot better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm Efwa Edubuasin from Oxford Brookes University. Thank you very much for your speech, which you highlighted the outcomes of Durban for mitigation and reducing carbon emissions. I'd be interested in knowing what significant outcomes were achieved regarding adaptation and creating concrete strategies for resilient economies to adjust to the adverse effects of climate change, particularly in developing countries. And lastly, I would like to know what difference did Durban make to the adaptation funding mechanisms, making it more accessible to developing countries? Thank you.
Great.
I just wondered what your advice, it's Sarah Butler-Sloss from the Ashton Awards. I wondered what your advice would be to the vested interests that are there to deny climate change. There's a huge rise in this country in climate denying, and the press is getting, there's a lot of press coverage on the negative sides of the argument that are denying climate change. And I wondered what your advice was, as we see both in America, in the UK, and increasingly in places like Germany, where there is this very anti-climate change dialogue going on.
Thanks. Gent behind.
Dan Hamza-Goodacre from the CDKN. My question picks up on the question from the gentleman earlier about voices from the South on agriculture, but I would couch it more generally, but also specifically in regard to the UNFCCC process. How can we best support the most vulnerable and least developed countries to engage effectively in the UNFCCC process?
Well, actually, I should turn the microphone over to Farhana to answer the question on adaptation. But let me give you the short answer: not enough. Okay, the short answer is clearly not enough done on adaptation, and it's always an uphill battle to get more movement on adaptation. At least now it's recognized as, at least in theory, being as important as mitigation, but only in theory, because the fact is that not enough is being done. What was done in Durban was finally this adaptation committee. How helpful that is going to be in terms of coordinating action and becoming more strategic about where the focus is on adaptation remains to be seen, and is very much the challenge of that body of work. Some advance on national adaptation plans, both for LDCs as well as the version for other vulnerable countries. Huge piece completely missing, and still in front of us is loss and damage. Honestly, other than the recognition that loss and damage has to be there, which I guess is a very good first step, but no work being done on that, and so still one of the big challenges in front of us. And on funding for adaptation, I guess indirectly there was progress in the sense that the Green Climate Fund was adopted. The operating instrument of the Green Climate Fund was adopted, and we know that there will be a window for adaptation. But when is that going to begin to flow? That'll still take some time, because what countries need to do this year is actually set up the governance system of that, set up the criteria for presentation of projects, set up the project cycle, and they need to capitalize the Green Climate Fund. So that takes me to long-term finance, of which the Green Climate Fund is one avenue, but that also is still very much work in progress. As many of you know, the Secretary General put out a report just before Cancun on long-term finance, but that has not been taken up yet by the negotiations, and that is on the agenda for this year to begin to look at that. I'm hoping that there is going to be a very out-of-the-box thinking with respect to long-term finance, because it is very clear that if you look at the potential costs of addressing climate, there is not enough public or private money, if you look at them separately, to actually effectively address climate. It is only when you creatively bring them together to increase the effectiveness and the impact of both of those sources that you can begin to responsibly address the cost of climate. So I'm hoping that there is going to be that out-of-the-box thinking. It's very clear that in terms of long-term finance, we cannot be in the situation of 2 + 2 is 4. We have to be in the situation of 2 + 2 is 5, 6, 7, or 8 in terms of the impact, because otherwise we will not be able to address it. So big, big piece of work still ahead of us. On support to LDC, well, we just had a quick half-an-hour conversation before we came in here precisely on that. And I would say the support can be at many different levels. One level, of course, is to support the negotiation itself and help the LDC countries be a more vocal voice in the convention. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Probably the much more challenging support that can be given to LDCs and to other vulnerable countries is to help them integrate all of this into their own countries. How do you do that? Honestly, you know, to do just the international thing, as complicated and as slow as that is probably the easier part. It's when you get down to implementation that there you really see the barriers go up, because none of us have done this before. And so if you really, really want to support LDCs, it is at home, on the ground, figuring out how to push forward development in a sustainable way. Vested interests. Yes, there are voices that continue to deny climate. I have the feeling that that these are very well organized, very well funded voices, but it clearly is not the majority. It just happens to be that they are so well organized and they have such good access to the megaphones that they use that they give us the impression that there is this huge questioning about climate change. The fact is that unless you're under 20, how many under 20s do we have? Not many in the room, do we? Okay, unless you're under 20, you yourself, with your own eyes, can see climate. Because I'm 55, and I'm very proud of my age. I can see the difference. I remember what it was. I remember how predictable precipitation was in my country. I remember we used to be able to set the clock. 9 o'clock is going to rain, 12 o'clock stops raining. It just doesn't happen that way anymore. And I have seen desertification creep up in my country. I've seen areas that go into cold spells that have no historical precedent. I have seen a species, the golden toad of Costa Rica, that was endemic to one of our tropical forests. I saw it disappear in my lifetime. And I'm sure that I can speak for all of you. You know, you can see the evidence. So if we can all see the evidence, then those voices that speak against climate, we know where they're coming from, and they are very, very well funded, and they're very well organized, but believe you me, they are not holding this back. They're not. We're moving forward. And on media coverage, what did I think about the media coverage in Durban? First of all, an amazing presence of media. I want to say, maybe I get the number wrong, but 1,500 journalists, more or less, maybe a few more or less, but 1,500 journalists present and registered in Durban. So anybody who tells me, like Camilla said, it's fallen off the radar screen to a certain extent, but actually I was very impressed by Durban, by the way, is way down there in the south. It's not exactly, you know, where everybody is. And the fact that there was such participation of the media was already, to me, a confirmation that the media is still engaged and continues to be engaged with this topic. The results of and they were very interested in finding out, okay, so what's happening today? Which is exactly what they should be doing. The results of Durban, the outcomes of Durban, had very mixed media coverage. And that, I would say, let me be the first one to take responsibility for that, okay? Because I think, we were so exhausted to remember those moments, but also, I don't think that we as an institution in the Secretariat, or those of you who follow climate and who do communication on climate, I don't think that we have done or are doing a very good job at communicating the progress in the climate process in a way that is understandable. It is very complex. We use all of these words and all of these acronyms that nobody understands, and we, get into these long, convoluted this is linked to that, and it's very, very difficult to understand. So I want to be the first one to take responsibility to say, we have got to change this. We have got to be able to figure out a message that conveys the reality of the climate process, which is a lot is happening for governments and certainly for business. A lot is happening. We're moving in the direction of low-carbon society. Nobody can convince me that we're not moving in the direction of a low-carbon society. So we're moving in the right direction. A lot is happening, and it is not fast enough. Clearly not fast enough. But somehow we have not been able to get that message across. And I take it upon myself for this year to do a better job about communicating that. In fact, I'll share with you even that I was in media training 2 days ago to try to figure this out. Why is it that I say something, and then the press says something, and I said, is that what I said? How? There seems to be no relationship here. So I take it upon myself and my responsibility this year, and I invite all of you who communicate on climate to join me in that challenge. How do we express this in a way that is usable by the media? Because the media can't do all of this convoluted thing. They needed front and center. Okay, what is the message? Tell me in words that my readers can understand. So it's a challenge, but one that I take up with joy.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Christiana. I think for you to think that you need more media training is quite
always
sobering, because I remember well listening to you last October in Copenhagen at the Global Green Growth Forum, and your lively description of how the climate change negotiations was a bit like being in a tropical building site with mud everywhere, and you were trying to push this wagon through the mud, and some people were pushing and others were pulling, and it was by no means certain that there was much momentum there, but done with great verve and energy and imagery, because I think we need images, we need stories, we need something kind of tangible to hold in the head that enables us to see what needs to happen next and why it's so urgent.